The Nazis are going cold in the heart of America and the silence is deafening. A trade war meant to save their as world is inadvertently accelerating its demise. Thousands of workers in Michigan and Minnesota are walking out the gates for the last time right now. The economic alliance that held North America together for decades is fracturing before our eyes. This is not just a market correction, it is a systematic dismantling of an industrial way of life. Subscribe now to understand the economic storm destroying the Midwest and come and still if you stand with the workers. Sea in Dearborn, Michigan, usually with the acrid scent of sulfur and a metallic tone of molten iron, as ground disturbingly clear in recent weeks. For generations, the rhythmic drum of several Nazis served as the heartbeat of this city, a sonic reassurance that the American industrial machine was alive and shining. But that heartbeat has begun to skip, faltering under the weight of a geopolitical standoff that feels both distant and intimately distractive. The massive steel coils that once rolled out of these factories by the ton, destined to become the spines of pickup trucks and the skeletons of skyscrapers, now sit in dusty cooling yards. It is a stillness that chills the blood of the local community more effectively than the biting winter winds sweeping no flake here. To understand this silence, one must look south, across the Rio Grande, where the origins of this catastrophe began to take shape long before the first ray of notice was printed. For years, a complex game of industrial arbitrage was being played in the shadows of international trade agreements. Mexican ports became busy entry points not just for domestic goods but for a global surplus of steel seeking a backdoor into the lucrative American market. Enormous container ships, heavily laden with alloy from across the Pacific, docked in increasing numbers, their cargoes with reliable and processed just enough to earn a new certificate of origin. This transshipment, a digital and physical sleight of hand, allowed vast quantities of metal to bypass protective walls Washington had tried to erect. The influx was at a lead fast, a slow rising tide that gradually grew the pricing power of American mills. Domestic executives watched the books bring out as cheaper alternatives flooded the supply chain, offering construction firms and auto manufacturers a way to slash costs in an inflationary economy. But what looked like a bargain on a balance sheet was a poison pill for the strategic independence of the United States. BLE 2025, the situation was undeniable. The market was awash in steel that claimed to be North American but carried the economic DNA of state-subsidized overproduction from thousands of miles away. The pressure on us producers, already grappling with high energy costs and aging infrastructure, became intolerable. Washington's response, when it finally came, was less like a scalpel and more like a sledgehammer's one in a crowded room. Citing national security and the urgency to protect domestic capacity, the government unleashed a new wave of tariffs that stunned the global market. The invocation of Section 232 followed by a dramatic escalation to a 50% duty on Mexican steel imports was intended to be a shield. Instead, it acted as a dam that stopped the flow of commerce so abruptly that the shockwave shattered the very industries it was meant to protect. The border, usually a fluid membrane of commerce, hardened into a barrier that left supply chains stranded and factories scrambling for materials they could no longer afford or access. The chaos was immediate and visceral at the logistics hubs along the Texas border. Miles of flatbed trucks, their suspensions groaning under the weight of rolled steel, set idling in the scorching sun, drivers unsure if they would be turned back or forced to pay crippling fees. The seamless integration of the North American auto sector, a marvel of modern efficiency where a single car part might cross the border 6 times before final assembly, ground to a halt. Incorporate boardrooms from Detroit to Monterrey, panic setting as just ultimate delivery schedule separated, replaced by indefinite delay notifications. The arteries of Detroit had been clamped shut and the industrial body began to go into shock. Nowhere was this shock felt more acutely than in the Iron Range of Minnesota. Here, Ceredeth is carved by immense open pit mines that have fed the nation's hunger for iron ore for over a century. The towns of Hibbing and Virginia, built on the backs of Taconite miners, expected the tariffs to be their salvation, a policy that would finally prioritize their labor over foreign imports. Instead, they received a cruel paradox. As the trade war expanded to include the automotive sector, the single largest consumer of steel demand for cars plummeted. With fewer cars being built, the need for new steel elevated. The mines, rather than ramping up production, received orders to idle operations. The layoff notices at Cleveland Cliffs and other major producers hit the community like a physical blow. 600 jobs in Michigan, another 600 in Minnesota, numbers that might seem small on a national scale but represents a total devastation of local economies. These are not transient gigs, they are the kind of union jobs that buy houses, send kids to college, and sustain the tax base of entire counties. When a miner in Hibbing loses their shift, the local diner loses its lunch rush, the car dealership sees its lots stay full, and the school district braces for budget cuts. The protection from Washington had arrived in the form of a pink slip, leaving families to wonder how a policy designed to help them had resulted in their livelihood disappearing. The atmosphere inside the idle plants is ghostly. Security guards patrol West Kevenas halls where the only light comes from the high windows, illuminating dust moles than seen in the stagnantea. The roar of the rolling mills, a noise so loud it vibrates in the chest, is gone, replaced by the dripping of condensation and the settling of cold metal. Workers who have spent decades mastering the dangerous art of smelting and casting now sit at kitchen tables, staring at Seven's paperwork, trying to calculate how long their savings will last. The betrayal feels personal. They were promised a manufacturing renaissance, a return to the glory days of American steel dominance, but the geopolitical chess match has sacrificed their pawns fast. Meanwhile, the diplomatic fallout has frozen relations between the USA and Mexico to a point of near zero visibility. The Sheinbaum administration, facing its own economic precipice with steel exports to the USA collapsing by nearly half, has been forced into a corner. Retaliatory matches were inevitable, creating a tit-for-tat escalation that threatens to unravel the USMCA entirely. The dialogue between the two nations, uncharacterized by the pragmatic friction of partners, as tending to the hostile silence of adversaries. A better of impulse is a brick in a growing wall that separates economies that have grown together like vines over the last 30 years. The unintended consequences of this trade war are rippling outward, touching industries that seem disconnected from steel but are inextricably linked by the complex web of macroeconomics. Construction projects in major US cities are stalling as the uncertainty over material costs makes bidding impossible. Infrastructure bills, passed with great fanfare to rebuild crumbling bridges and roads, are finding their budgets stretched to the breaking point as the price of domestic steel, now protected from competition but suffering from lack of scale, remains stubbornly high and volatile. The irony is bitter. The steel is American-made, but the bridges it was supposed to build remain on paper. In the automotive heartland, the situation is even more dire. The industrial boomerang effect has taken hold. By effectively taxing the raw materials and the finished vehicles, the policies have squeezed the automakers from both ends. They cannot import cheap steel to keep costs down, and they cannot export cars efficiently due to retaliatory tariffs. The result is a shrinking market, and a shrinking market needs few effects. The Dearborn Works, a facility with a storied history of surviving depressions and wars, now faces an uncertain future, not because it is inefficient, but because the market it serves is being strangled by severe ropes meant to save it. As winter deepens, the psychological toll on their as birds becomes a heaviest burden. These are communities that have weathered the industrialization before in the 70s and 80s, and they carry a generational trauma of those collapses. They know what it looks like when the main employer leaves town, the boarded lobster fronts, the decaying parks, the exodus of the young. Since the cycle repeats, this theme triggered via protective measure breeds a cynical despair. The trust in political solutions is eroded infested than the oxidizing metal in the scrapyards. The belief that anyone in the capital understands the intricate reality of the factory floor is gone. The complexity of the global steel market means that simply turning the machines back on is not an option. Unseablest finance is called, restarting it is a massive, expensive, and dangerous technical undertaking. It requires weeks of preparation and millions of dollars. Owners are hesitant to make that investment when the trade policy changes with the political winds. So the plenty title technically post bad functionality while the workers drift away to other states or other industries, taking their institutional knowledge with them. The brain drain is the imagines the economic loss. The skills required to make high-grade military or automotive steel are not ending a week. There is a grim reality settling in that this might be a new normal. The North American standoff shows no sign of thawing. Read the 2026 review of the USMC aluminum. Both sides are digging in. Using the livelihoods of steelworkers as leveraging a broader negotiation about migration, drugs, and sovereignty, the steelworker in Minnesota checking his bank balance is merely a bargaining chip in a high-stakes game played by diplomats. WHO have never worn a hard hat. The disconnect between the policy rhetoric making steel strong and the reality than employment. Lines is a chasm that cannot be bridged by speeches. The environmental aspect of this crisis adds another layer of grim irony. American steel is amongst the cleanest in the world. Produced with strict environmental controls, be idling these plants and inadvertently engaging production in unregulated markets which then finds its way to other buyers. The global carbon footprint of the industry likely increases, but in as bad climate cancers take a backseat to survival when you cannot put food on the table. You do not worry about carbon credits, you worry about the heat being turned off, you worry about the silence in the plant becoming permanent. In the local bars of the Midwest, the conversation has shifted from sports to survival strategies. Men and women swap tips on unemployment benefits on which tracking companies are still hiring. On whether it's time to sell the house before the market crashes. There is a palpable a sense of having been said they were told that the foreign steel was the enemy. That if they could just stop the imports, the good times would roll. They stopped the imports, but the good times never came. Instead, the customs vanished casualties of the same war. The narrative of Mexico crashing the US market has evolved into a story of mutual destruction. Mexico lost a vital export market, causing economic pain south of the border that will inevitably lead to more migration pressure. Another issue the US is desperate to solve. The US lost its low-cost inputs and its export markets, leading to inflation and job losses. It is a perfect negative feedback loop. The steel that sits rusting in the right yards is a monument to the failure of blunt force economic policy in a delicate, interconnected world. As we look towards the uncertain future of 2026, the question remains, can this damage be undone? Can the blasphemous be ignited or will they become museums of a bygone era? The specialized supply chains that have been severed will not easily knit themselves back together. Trust on the broken between suppliers and buyers is hard to rebuild. Sarah's belt is resilient. Yes, but resilience has its limits. There is a breaking point where a community simply ceases to function as a viable economic entity and form any towns in this region. That point is visibly on the horizon. The tragedy is that the demand for steel is still there. Theoretically, the world still needs to build, but the mechanisms to get the metal from the earth to the ground have been jammed by political intervention. The historic Rust Belt catastrophes are not natural disasters, they are man-made calamities born of a failure to understand that in a globalized economy, you cannot simply wall off one section without cutting off the blood flow to the rest of the body. The patient American manufacturing is on life support, and the cure is proving to be as deadly as the disease. Ultimately, the story of this steel crisis is a warning. It is a warning that economic nationalism, while politically potent, carries a heavy price tag often paid by the very people it claims to champion. The silence of the affected is inborn and heaving is a testimony to this cast. It is a silence that demands to be heard, avoid that screams of missed opportunities and strategic miscalculations. As the snow begins to cover the idle machinery, bearing the physical evidence of industry, the human cost remains visible in every foreclosure sign and every empty lunchbox. Sarah's belt is burning not with the fire of production, but with the fever of a crisis that has no easy end in sight.